Today, I'm going to be doing a real-world dual review of the Panasonic GH5 and the Sony A7S II. I shoot an outdoor show on this YouTube channel and have done 11 episodes with the GH4, 9 episodes with the A7S II, in addition to over 500 vlogs on my personal channel, and 1 episode with the GH5. Today I'll only be discussing the GH5 and A7S II, but I'll be basing a lot of this off of my experience with the GH4, since it's so similar to the GH5. And before we begin, I'd also like to note that this review is purely for video features. I don't take stills with either camera with the exception of time lapses. So, if you want to cut to the chase and just hear what you should pick if you absolutely can only get one of these cameras, it comes down to one thing. Do you need extreme low light performance and the shallow depth of field you can get from a full frame sensor? If these two features are make or break for you, then you have to pick the Sony. There really is no choice. Otherwise, the GH5 is a better camera in just about every way. Both cameras produce fantastic video in most lighting conditions, but I shoot an outdoors show, and I am much more concerned with how well the camera facilitates me getting good shots quickly and efficiently on the first try in real-world conditions. And in this regard, the GH5 beats the A7S II hands down. But before I go more in depth, let's take a look at these two cameras so you can see how I came to my conclusion. Now, since I do think it's the most important consideration when comparing these two cameras, let's talk about the low light performance and shallow depth of field. The A7S II has a full frame sensor which primarily gives you two benefits. The first is it's very easy to get a shallow depth of field. Take this shot we did in our Yellowstone episode. It's so easy to get a shallow depth of field like this shot, and it's beautiful. This was at f1.8 on the Sony 55mm, and I love the way it looks. The other benefit of a full frame sensor is the low light performance. This camera performs so well in low light, it almost feels like it's a night vision camera. For this shot of the Northern Lights from our Algonquin episode, it just would not have been possible without the A7S II. This was a once-in-a-lifetime shot that you literally cannot put a price on. It would not have even been visible with the GH5 in most other cameras. Or take this shot of the car and the stars taken from our Monongahela episode. Being able to film the stars in real time is something we only dreamed about for years. Or take a look at the opening shots from our Wayne episode shot entirely in the dark. The image is amazingly clean, and you can actually see what's going on. This type of shooting just wouldn't be possible with any other camera in this price range. This is the defining feature of the A7S II, and it's the most important consideration when choosing between these two cameras. So the Panasonic GH5 uses the micro four thirds format, which is about a fourth of the size of a full frame sensor. This affects both depth of field and low light performance. You'll still be able to get the same shallow depth of field, it's just a little harder and more inconvenient. So that's not a huge deal, but definitely something to keep in mind, especially when you're deciding what lenses you want to buy as well. Additionally, with a sensor that small, your low light performance is just not going to be as good. There's really only so much noise reduction and image processing you can do to clean up an image. Here you can see a shot from our Yosemite episode shot on the GH4 at f2.8 at night. It's certainly still usable, but is nowhere near the clean image you can get from the A7S II. Micro Four Thirds does have one advantage though, which is that you can get incredibly close to your subject even without a macro lens. This shot from our Red River Gorge episode was shot with a 12 to 35mm lens, literally inches from the subject. This allows us to get all sorts of great close-ups of mushrooms, bugs, and all of our other footage with just one lens. There's no need to have a separate macro lens like we would on the Sony A7S II. Now that we know where the two cameras stand in regards to their low light capabilities and sensor size, let's talk about actually using the cameras. This is where I'm going to explain how I think the GH5 is a better camera in just about every way. So, since we are in outdoor shows and we're out backpacking for 3 to 4 days, let's start with battery life. So on the left we have an A7S II battery, and on the right we have a GH5 battery. Just looking at the physical size of the batteries, you already know the GH5 battery will last significantly longer. In our experience, we can get through almost an entire day of shooting with just one official Panasonic battery. With the Sony official batteries, we're lucky if we get through the whole day using less than 3. We do have third-party batteries for both cameras, and while neither last as long as their official counterparts, the GH5 batteries also last much longer. The A7S II eats through batteries to an extremely frustrating degree. There have been many episodes where by the end of the trip, we're literally cycling through depleted batteries to try and squeeze just a few more shots out of them. So you might think, well, why don't you just bring more batteries? For one thing, we have to carry everything when we're filming our episodes, and any additional weight is more than a little unwelcome. For another thing, charging so many batteries before every trip is a hassle I'd rather not have to deal with. The GH5 wins in battery life, hands down. Next up, let's talk about the screens and viewfinders. The GH5 has a flip screen while the A7S II has a rear screen that articulates up and down. Additionally, the GH5 has a touchscreen, which we'll get into in a little bit. As someone who doesn't shoot in controlled environments where you can have an external monitor, a screen that is bright and visible even in daylight and can flip to all sorts of different angles is crucial. The GH5 screen is very bright and the screen flips to every angle we could need, especially to the front, so if we don't actually have someone operating the camera, we can still check to see if everything's working. It's also really helpful if you shoot vlogs. The A7S II screen, you just have to hope that everything was set up right and nothing goes wrong mid-shot like it running out of batteries. And yes, the battery life is that awful on the A7S II, so I'm mentioning it again. But even if the A7S II screen did articulate and flip to the front, it's just not bright enough. It's almost unusable in daylight. Additionally, if you shoot in 4K, which we do, you can't actually adjust the brightness. When it comes to the screen, the GH5 wins as well. Quick addendum, however, the viewfinders on both cameras are excellent. They're both sharp, and since you look into the eyepiece, their brightness doesn't matter so much, even in sunlight. The GH5, I will say, has the slight edge in quality, but it's not such a huge advantage that it's something I would miss when using the A7S II. So this next category is going to cover a lot of things, but in general, I'm talking about the ergonomics and ease of use of actually using the cameras. Let's start with something you do all the time: focusing. I'm not going to talk about continuous autofocus on either camera that much because honestly, they're both not great. The GH5 does have many settings that I haven't experimented with too much, so the possibility remains it could actually be better, but it wins in the manual focus department anyway, so let's talk about that. First, there's a physical switch to go from manual to autofocus. The A7S II relies on a button that you inexplicably have to press twice just to get it to switch focusing modes. And that's not even the default setting, which requires you to hold the button to switch back and forth between manual and autofocus. That sounds like a niggling complaint, but when you're trying to get a shot quickly, it's anything but. Anyway, when you're manually focusing, the GH5 focus ring is very precise and the focus peaking is very helpful. When you start to pull focus, the image punches in and magnifies with a very sharp image to help you grab focus. The focus peaks are very accurate and you can tell what's in focus. Even though I believe both cameras use fly-by-wire focusing, the A7S II focus ring almost has some sort of weird acceleration, and focusing never feels accurate, and you can forget even trying to pull off a rack focus smoothly. Additionally, when the image punches in on the A7S II, it's so pixelated that I'm rarely confident that something is even in focus, and the focus peaks give so many false positives that you can only be sure something is actually in focus by going back and forth a couple of times until you find the highest density of focus peaks. The GH5 also allows for touchscreen focusing, which is absolutely fantastic. I didn't realize how much I missed it because our GH4's touchscreen has been broken for a while now, and I've been using the A7S II for so long, I've gotten used to not having it. But to be able to just touch right where you want to focus is amazing. So for focusing, the GH5 wins again. Next up is button placement and ease of use. Again, this is another tale of two cameras, so to speak, with the GH5 being well thought out, intuitive, and quick, while the A7S II is cumbersome, unintuitive, and even inconsistent. Let's take a look at what the GH5 does and why I wish the A7S II did it as well. First off, you can record with the shutter button, something inexplicably the A7S II is incapable of. You can set record to one of the custom buttons, but this also uses up a custom button. The GH5 even has a separate record button that is nice and easy to press. The A7S II has one, but not only is it terribly placed, it's indented so it's hard to press. The GH5 has dedicated white balance and ISO buttons, two things I use all the time. The A7S II requires you to put these on shortcut buttons, which I will add there are not enough of. And the wheel buttons aren't exactly hard to press, but they aren't convenient and feel imprecise. The GH5 has a dedicated button to switch between the viewfinder and screen, or to toggle the viewfinder sensor on and off. The A7S II, in contrast, requires you to search through the menus. There's other niggling things like turning focus peaks on and off. On the GH5, I can merely press a shortcut and it will toggle through the different focus peak options, while on the A7S II, I have to press the focus peak button and then use the directional inputs to select the one I want and then press enter. It's just cumbersome and not well thought out. Furthermore, the menus are really bad on the A7S II. I've been using this camera for a year and a half and have shot over 500 videos with it, and I still have trouble finding things. The GH5 isn't much better in this department, but I will say that the menus are more fast and responsive, but using a touchscreen makes it much quicker and more pleasant than the slow, unresponsive, clunky menus of the A7S II. The A7S II also hides one really important feature to me behind this slow and clunky menu in the time-lapse mode. You actually have to pay $10 for a sort of in-camera app to be able to do time-lapses at all, and the interface is slow and painful. Loading it up takes forever, making any changes takes forever, and you can only dim the screen while it's taking pictures. You can't actually turn off the screen to save battery life. The GH5, on the other hand, has time-lapse built in, and you just flip the shooting mode to time-lapse. You can very easily change the settings, as pressing the menu button instantly takes you to the time-lapse settings. You can also pause the time-lapse at any time by pressing the FN1 button, something you can't do on the A7S II. Additionally, while this isn't crucial or anything, you can make a video of your time-lapse in camera after it finishes, and even delete your time-lapse photos to save space. And new to the GH5 over the GH4, you can put in a second SD card and save any time-lapses to that one to help with organization. A small but welcome addition. And I don't know exactly what this falls under, but the A7S II has a record time limit of 29 minutes of continuous shooting. For professional shooting, especially for interviews, this is a nightmare. The GH5 has no such limitation. Fortunately, some awesome user actually made a hack that removes the time limit on the Sony A7S II, and I've used it many times and it works great. Though in this case, the battery will be your biggest roadblock to recording for long periods of time. This limit is in place for Sony to avoid paying a tax on what classifies as a video camera, but it sucks that they aren't willing to absorb that price for the sake of their customers. Adding on to ergonomics and ease of use, the A7S II actually wins in one category, which is lens removal. With the A7S II, the lens removal button is placed where your right hand can press it at the same time that you're holding the camera, and you can easily take the lens off with your left hand. The GH5, on the other hand, has a lens release button on the left side, and you have to do this awkward dance to get it off while still holding the camera. We switch lenses quite often, and the camera isn't always on a tripod, so this is actually a consideration for us. One final note is that the GH5 is weatherproofed. I've looked before to see if Sony claims the A7S II to be weatherproofed, but I haven't found a definitive answer. I will say though that on one of our particularly rainy episodes, such as this one in Wayne, the A7S II screen died on this final shot of the episode, while the GH4 kept going strong. We were able to get it repaired under warranty, fortunately, but it did break. Now the touchscreen eventually broke on the GH4 a few episodes later, probably from additional rain, so it's not perfect. But I will say from my experience, I would trust the GH5 to survive in the rain over the A7S II. So the GH5 wins in ergonomics and ease of use. It feels like they really listen to what people actually need in a camera, and it's very well designed. The A7S II feels like it was made by an engineer making sure you could actually do everything the camera needs to do, but with no thought of the actual user experience. So next, I'm going to talk about video quality and video features, but probably less so than you're used to in other reviews. My reasoning is that both of these cameras produce absolutely fantastic looking images. And with picture profiles, color grading, and lenses, your experience can vary so much that I'm not going to say that one is better than the other. In addition, I'm not good at color grading, setting up picture profiles, or maximizing dynamic range, so I don't feel qualified to make judgments on either camera's color, dynamic range, or anything like that. I'll leave that to other much more qualified YouTubers to help you make those judgments. To my eye though, they're both fantastic, so you really can't go wrong either way. Oh, and one note about the 10-bit 422 on the GH5. Like I said, I don't color grade, besides adding saturation to unnatural levels, so maybe it could help me, but I don't really know how to use it, and as of the time of this review, it's broken in Premiere, so I won't talk about it anyway. That being said, there are some key differentiators. Probably the biggest one being that the GH5 can do internal 4K 60 frames per second, whereas the A7S II maxes out at 4K 30 frames per second. And for our purposes, we use quite a bit of slow motion, so the GH5's 4K slow motion was a very welcome addition. It looks stunning, and the results from our episode in New River Gorge were absolutely outstanding. The A7S II can do 1080p 120 frames per second, but it looks a little ugly. It also crops in on the image fairly significantly. You can see here from our Clifty Wilderness episode how it looks. Not great, but still passable. The GH5 can do 1080p 180 frames per second, and here's what it looks like at 180 frames per second. Both cameras have a stabilized sensor and they work well on both. I have had an issue with the A7S II where it almost locks in after a second, especially when I'm on a tripod. I'm not sure if that's a bug of my camera, but as long as I know about it, it's not a big deal because I just keep that in mind when I'm shooting. The GH5 has the edge here though because it actually allows the lens and the sensor to stabilize in tandem. They call this the dual IS system. And while it's not going to work miracles, it does look great. Additionally, the GH5 has an electronic stabilizer that will crop the image in a little bit and give you an even more stabilized image. I imagine I won't be using this on the channel's videos because we generally bring a glide cam, but it'd be great for vlogs and other handheld footage. In the end though, we generally use the A7S II with the 16-35mm on a glide cam, and it produces great results as you can see in our Yellowstone episode here. So one final note on the quality of the videos from these two cameras. I actually prefer the way the GH5 image looks. I don't know what it is or if it's just my settings, but there's something about the quality of the motion that I just really like with the GH5. Now, as I mentioned before, I am not by any stretch an expert on color grading or picture profile tweaking, so it's possible you can get the A7S II looking like the GH5. But in my experience, I just like the way it looks better than the A7S II out of the box. But your mileage may vary in that regard depending on your skill and taste. And one final note, in my experience, the GH5 seems to have a much better auto white balance than the A7S II. So finally, there are a few more miscellaneous considerations. First up is sound quality. I use a Rode VideoMic Pro on both cameras, and both of them sound great and have workably low noise floors. The A7S II does get the slight edge here, but they both sound good.
This is what it sounds like talking into the GH5, and this is what it sounds like talking into the A7S II.
Next up is weight and size. One nice thing about the Micro Four Thirds format is that the lenses are much smaller and lighter. This 12-35mm lens on the GH5 is a hulking beast on the A7S II with Sony's 24-70mm. The GH5 is heavier without a lens though, and honestly, they're both super heavy with a lens, so they both kind of suck in this department. Additionally, these lines of cameras seem to be getting bigger rather than smaller. The GH5 is bigger than the GH4, and the A7S II is bigger than the original A7S. Not a great trend, but everything else is getting better at least. And one last consideration before we go to the conclusion: price. The GH5 is $700 cheaper than the A7S II. That is no small difference. I bought the GH5 at $2,000 with a used 12-35mm lens for $500, so a total price of $2,500. The A7S II I bought for $3,000 plus $1,200 for the 16-35mm lens for a total of $4,200. Now those lenses aren't equivalent, so that's not exactly the same, but just camera price alone is $700 different. Now, for me, I also use these cameras for professional use, so they're tools to make money. Also, I just cannot put a price on the fact that $4,200 allowed me to capture the northern lights. Well, in this case, technically $3,800 since I was using the 55mm f1.8 I bought for $800. This is something I literally could not have done with the GH5. So even if I had saved the money, I would be without a shot of the northern lights. In conclusion, both cameras produce some fantastic looking visuals. The A7S II has the obvious and clear advantage in low light, but it lags behind the GH5 in just about every other way. I think you really have to look at what you need in a camera and what your budget is. Honestly, for me, if I could only have one of these cameras, despite all its shortcomings, I'd probably still get the A7S II. The low light performance is that miraculous. But in my past year and a half of daily use, it's been nothing but a pain using the camera. I've dealt with it, but it's just a poorly designed camera. But if I were going into a shooting situation where I didn't know the lighting conditions, I'd bring the A7S II because I know I would be just fine no matter what the lighting is. But since I do have both, I would rather use the GH5 9 times out of 10. It has a better screen, it has a better battery, it has better ergonomics and ease of use. It's just a better camera to actually shoot with. The GH5 is a fantastic camera that I wouldn't hesitate to recommend to anyone shooting video. The A7S II, I would almost call a specialty camera that can make miracles in low light. But it's almost like a Goosebumps novel or something. Be careful what you wish for, because you have to deal with all of its baggage, like its terrible screen, bad user interface, and short battery life. So who wins? I'll let you decide, but for my purposes, I bought both. The GH5 will get 90% of my usage, and the A7S II will get the other 10. I hope this review has been helpful. Feel free to leave comments below and I'll try to get back to you. And also, feel free to look at all of our episodes to see how the A7S II and the GH4, which is the GH5's predecessor, look in action. In general, tripod shots are the GH4 and glide cam and low light shots are the A7S II. If you like what we're doing, feel free to support us at patreon.com/adventure. Feel free to give the video a like and subscribe if you're not already. Thank you very much, and good luck on your decision.